Hello and welcome once again to The Blueprints. This is Canada's Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, for the Lakes Brock. We thank you so much for joining us because we do have new content for you every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And because of this information, we need you and we need your help to like, comment, subscribe, share this program, help us push back against the ever-moving liberal agenda, and maybe someone in your social media network will get this message, someone who might be open to hearing this conservative message that they don't get from the mainstream media. And this is how we are going to make sure that Erin O'Toole is the next Prime Minister of Canada. Of course, as always, if you can't watch it now in this moment, you can download it later on. Listen to it on platforms like Castbox, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, you name it. It is out there. Our topic today, very informative, very timely, based on what's going on in the world today. We are entering Justin Trudeau's third wave of the COVID pandemic because of his failure to secure enough vaccine supply for Canadians. And we now see that they are finally taking action on the border. They've suspended, as of last Thursday, incoming flights from India and Pakistan due to the rising caseloads and the variant concerns that we're seeing. Last week alone, India reached a high of 314,000 new cases in just one day. And now that we have the suspension for 30 days, gives health officials here time to figure things out. But as we're seeing in the news, the variant's already here, unfortunately, and it is a deadly variant. 39 cases in British Columbia, a couple in Quebec, more in Ontario. We welcome Shannon Stubbs, the Member of Parliament for Lakeland. She's also the Shadow Minister for Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Hello, Shannon. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, Jamie, thanks for having me.
Well, this is something we have called for well over a year now. The border needs to be tightened up, and we said so over a year ago. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, you're exactly right. And inconsistency and lack of action early on the border is partly why Canadians are continuing to face restrictions in their daily lives, in their businesses, between their families. And I think it's a real indictment of the Liberals that a year ago, it was last January, Jamie, when we told the Liberals to lock down the borders to stop incoming cases of COVID-19. They suggested that we were doing that for reasons other than protecting the public health and safety of Canadians, delayed and dithered, and then ultimately did it, of course. But what has been happening since is utter chaos, uncertainty, and a lack of clarity and consistency in terms of what Canadians face when they go to the border. The Liberals have created such a mess. It's really difficult for the average Canadian to figure out, if they're considered an essential worker, if they'll be allowed across the border back and forth. And it's a gamble every time a Canadian goes to the border, maybe believing that they are an essential worker or that they're in an essential sector, and their jobs, their work, their businesses, and their livelihoods are just sort of at the whim of the decision of any individual border agent, of course, all of whom are struggling to keep up with the constant changes and inconsistency from the Liberals.
So now we're seeing cases, not just in Canada, but it's particularly hard because this is our focus. We're seeing the Brazilian variant, we're seeing the variant from India, the one from the UK, and others that just seem to be showing that the COVID virus is getting, in many cases, deadlier. We're seeing younger people getting it, healthier people getting sick, which is extremely concerning because these variants got in because of liberal failures. And you look at countries like New Zealand and Australia. Yes, sure, they're an island, but they tightened their borders almost immediately. And yes, they did have lockdowns, and some were severe than what we've seen here. But at the end of the day, the variants aren't getting into those countries because they acted fast.
Right. And I think those are exactly the essential questions that Canadians should be asking right now. How it could be that we're a year in, and the utter failure in securing vaccine supply to keep pace with our allies and countries in the developed world, but also, of course, having tried to strike up a $44 million deal with China and then have them shockingly take the money and bail out. Not so shocking. And then also being, a country that where the prime minister tried to take vaccine supply from developing countries. Fast forward through all these months, and it seems like the Liberals are restricting and locking down the things they shouldn't be, while being slow to act on taking action against, international flights. And that's a confusion I've heard from Canadians and from constituents, frankly, for the entire year. They say, these both municipalities and provinces are being forced into making all kinds of difficult decisions governing the daily lives of their citizens. Meanwhile, international flights have been landing in Canadian airports very freely until the Liberals finally acted last week.
I think you brought up something pretty important right there. A lot of these measures that have been taking place and being implemented, especially the COVID hotels and such, have been targeted on Canadian citizens for the most part, almost as a deterrent to keep them from traveling, which is fine, but making people's lives miserable, which are affecting those. Maybe they've gone south for the winter, maybe they've stayed in Florida, that kind of thing. But there is no real consistency to these measures. And you're right, they are confusing at best.
Yeah, and it's having a major impact on people's lives. People who have traveled for compassionate grounds, believing that they're well within the rules and that they should have no problems, then facing, different decisions on, on both sides of their trips, and huge personal costs, and having to quarantine and take time from work. People who even have had essential medical services outside of the country have come back to face just a massive mess in terms of what they have to do when they get back in. And also, what can't be understated is the economic impact. And this is, I think, why Canadians are rightful to have so many questions and to be skeptical about the decisions that are being made, because we're in a situation where it seems like the Public Health Agency of Canada and the health minister make recommendations. Many of those rules are carried out by transport, but then individual border agents are on the front lines trying to execute whatever they perceive the directions to be. And Jamie, can you imagine this? I months ago asked a series of questions to the public safety minister on the evidence for the decisions that they're making, the data they've used, the science behind their restrictions. They haven't to date provided any of that with regard to either their travel restrictions or their quarantine hotel program, which, as you know, we've called to be shut down. And yet people are facing this challenge on a daily basis, impacting their jobs, impacting their work. The public safety minister points his fingers at the health minister. Transport is somewhere in the middle, making up the rules. And 2 months ago, I asked the public safety minister what he was doing in terms of providing training, real-time training and real-time support to border agents who are stuck in the middle of all of this, doing their best to deal with the ever-changing and inconsistent rules. And guess what? Even in a press release in his own department, I think on March 25th, it acknowledged they're still developing training for border agents. I mean, we're in like a year in, right? With catastrophic impacts on Canadians' daily lives. And so no wonder it is so confusing and so disruptive for the average Canadian to figure out, what they're supposed to be doing.
But how long was it, Shannon? I don't expect a perfect number here. How long was it that we, as the opposition and the media itself, I'll give them credit as well, pointed out that international flights were coming into our major airports, and basically there was no COVID screening, there was no information. Basically, you got a pamphlet on what COVID is and what you should do, and then people were sent on their way, which was shocking when you look at the action other countries were taking to stop, at that point, the original COVID virus from getting in and spreading.
Yeah, completely. It has been over a year. That's not an exaggeration. Our first calls for the Liberals to take action on the border was at the end of January in 2020. And simultaneously, our colleague Michelle Rumpel-Garner and other conservatives, and we as a Conservative Party, we're consistently saying implement pre and post arrival rapid testing. Be clear and certain about the rules and about the benchmarks and about your evidence. And there were was for example an extremely successful pilot project in Calgary that could have been implemented right across the country, and the Liberals just dragged their heels and failed to act. And so here Canadians are still facing this ongoing and uncertainty and lack of clarity and all this craziness.
So we have failures on the border, failures with vaccine procurement. We have issues with some of the relief programs that were brought in. Of course, we know that we charity scandal, but we had problems with the rent control or the rent subsidy program, which only 10% of businesses across Canada subscribed to. The wage subsidy originally was only 10%, covering employers and employees' wages. And there were a whole bunch of other things that we had to deal with as the opposition, trying to pressure the government, but yet they kept failing one thing after the other. And you remember when Parliament was suspended right at the beginning, the first thing they did when they were trying to come back is take away powers of Parliament and allow the executive branch to run everything, almost like a dictatorship,
Mhm.
and barely a peep from the Liberal backbenchers on this.
Oh yes. Well, that isn't that the case. They're just silent and go along to get along. But Jamie, what really strikes me is that the Liberals, despite doing exactly what you're talking about, trying to make decisions by fiat, and basically be completely unrestrained by the scrutiny and the diligence of members of Parliament. Finally, they've just put forward a budget after 2 years, the first time I think that that's ever happened. And I think what was notably missing from that budget, in amidst all the pre-election spending campaigns, was a plan for economic recovery and reopening of the Canadian economy. And I think that is very concerning in the context of what is going on at the border, and in particular with our largest trading partner, the United States. I've heard, and I know that you have heard, and members of Parliament, especially in our border communities, our border ridings, have just heard a series of nightmares of workers and businesses who are deemed essential, who end up crossing the border and then being either denied or told they have to quarantine for 14 days. This has major impacts on, manufacturing and all kinds of sectors. But I've heard so many situations in Ontario where this is the trouble around the policy versus the enforcement, where they require workers and their business partners to travel between the United States and Canada. In many cases in Canada, just to come into a factory to check a few things, maybe they would spend 2 or 3 hours, but that's a requirement in order for them, in order for the manufacturing process to be able to start for them to do their work there. And but because of the lack of clarity around the rules, often they are getting told that they have to quarantine. Well, the Canadian businesses are saying, like, our American partners or American contractors aren't going to come for what normally is a 3-hour appointment in our factory and quarantine for 14 days. Meanwhile, they have off the chart success in terms of protecting public health. Very few cases of any spreading. And the Liberals on one hand are trying to say that they're protecting the Canadian economy and essential workers, but are presiding over this disaster, which is losing Canadian businesses, contracts, business partners, and frankly, just helping the American businesses and American side of the sector to thrive.
I will contradict you a bit. I don't want to go too far down this hole because we only have a few minutes left. But when you say the Liberals don't have a plan for economic recovery, I would also say I think there might be something in there for economic recovery, but it's their reimagined economic recovery.
Yeah.
And if you look at the dollar value, if this is truly a health crisis, why wasn't more invested in actual health care, in long-term care facilities, in improving those conditions? But yet we see all this money, this slush fund, all this money for infrastructure outside the normal government budgetary process, and a whole bunch of other things, including national daycare, disguised as COVID relief funding. They're just using it as an excuse to fire up the credit card even more.
Yes, I mean, I would completely agree with you that they are very much a government with an agenda of ever expanding and increasing government powers, government authority, government spending. They don't seem to value the private sector or entrepreneurs. They seem to be fully part of this theory that government creates jobs, and they give no they like sustainable jobs in the economy. Of course, we believe the private sector does that, and of course also value our core frontline public servants. But they they think nothing of $100 billion in new spending. That's very hard to decipher how it will make a difference in Canadians' daily lives. And then to have the debt that they're headed towards. Um, just total disregard for our moral responsibility to spend within our means and put needs before wants, and ensure that we pass on a sustainable fiscal situation for governments for future generations. I think it's extremely concerning.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with more. If this is a budget truly to tackle the COVID pandemic, then healthcare should have been front and center, and unfortunately, it wasn't. Shannon, we are running out of time, but I always gives the guests the final word, and you know this because you've been on the show a few times. I give the floor to you to wrap things up for us.
Okay, well, I don't know how to wrap this up, except I would just say that I hope that Canadians will keep pushing the Liberals to give clarity and certainty and a roadmap for economic recovery for the country. I hope they'll keep pushing the Liberals to explain exactly how it is that they are going to secure Canada's jobs and secure the future. And and then, of course, if there are any experiences that Canadian workers or businesses or families are having, I sure would appreciate to hear from them. And I know that goes the same for all Conservative MPs in the official opposition, because it's crucial for us to know how these out of touch Liberal policies and procedures are impacting their lives, and to be able to advocate for them.
As always, we thank Shannon Stubbs, the Member of Parliament for Lakeland, also the Shadow Minister for Emergency Preparedness and Public Safety. She's always great on her feet and always has lots to say, and we appreciate it because it is very valuable. And because it is valuable, we ask that you like, comment, subscribe, share this program, help us push back against the ever-moving Liberal agenda, because there's got to be someone in your social media network that would be open to hearing that Conservative message. This is one way to do it and ensure that Erin O'Toole is the next Prime Minister of Canada. If you missed some of this, you can download it later on, listen to it on platforms like Castbox, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, you name it, it is out there. New content every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We do appreciate you being here. We hope to see you next week. Remember, low taxes, less governments, more freedom. That is the blueprint.